Hey mamas, today we are talking with Anya Dunham. She is the author of Baby Ecology, a really great science-packed book about the biology of your baby and how they grow, how they develop, and what you can do to support that. So today we are going to talk about what your babies are capable of and can learn in the womb, and through those first few years, what your babies are capable of, what kinds of sensory and stimulation types of things can actually hinder or help your baby's development. We talk a little bit about sleep, and we had some technical difficulties with this episode. We were unable to use my normal recording software, so I used Zoom, and apparently I didn't have the right Zoom plan to record more than maybe 20, 30 minutes with her. So I will get into the episode with you here, and then I'll pop back in at the end to cover a couple more topics from her book that I wanted to cover with you guys. So enjoy the episode. Catch you after. Hey mamas, welcome to Modern Nurture. I'm here today with Anya. She's the author of Baby Ecology. This is a great book. I can't wait to dig into it. Anya, welcome. Will you give us a little introduction of yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Anya Dunham, and in my day job, I'm a research scientist studying biology. I have a PhD in biology, and I'm also a mom to three young kids. And I'm the author of Baby Ecology, in which I applied my training as a biologist and kind of intersected that with a huge interest in early childhood development. So in this book, I tried to figure out what do all babies need from their environment. So it's sort of marrying my training as an ecologist and my heart of a parent.
I really loved reading the book because it was just very practical and just very like you were just giving the fundamentals. And you're like, your baby can do this at this stage. Your baby does not cannot respond to this, or this hinders your baby's growth. So I really enjoyed that. Today, I was hoping we could start with prenatal learning because I think that's a thing we don't often think about until maybe the stage where your baby starts to kick and maybe can respond to certain things. So, can you explain how babies begin to learn and develop sensory awareness while they're still in the womb?
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of parents don't realize, and something that I didn't realize until I started reading all the primary literature about it. So our babies are actually a lot more capable than many of us think. I think it's fairly well known that babies can hear us in the third trimester. We often advise to read to our babies, to play music and talk to them. But the fact that they not only can hear us quite well, but also memorize and learn while they're still in the womb, I think that's something that isn't as well known. So, for example, if the mom is the one who carries the pregnancy, if she reads the same story, recites a poem to the baby, then the baby responds to that poem if they've heard it several times. So that tells us that they not only heard the mom reading it, but also were able to remember it and to react to it at the time when they hear it again. So to me,
So,
that's
so you,
that's
they
you know,
react to it once they're born, or they react to it
um,
in the womb.
even before that, even while they're still in the womb, and also as well after they're born as well.
And
So
how did the study investigators know that the baby was reacting? Was it like a physical reaction?
it was a bit of both. So they looked at their physical movements and they looked at the brain, like the patterns of brain activity. And so
Mm,
they were able to tell that the baby responds to something that they have heard before.
that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Are there any other skills we should know about? If
Oh,
not, I was
well,
going to ask for some suggestions for the audience to take advantage of their baby's skills in the womb that they might not know about.
yeah, exactly. And then maybe reading something that the mom enjoys herself so that it's a nice experience for both mom and baby. And I think it's also learning that when after babies are born, they are also a lot more sort of capable than we sometimes give them credit for. But in some ways, they also a lot more sensitive too. So, like for example, it's been shown that when we give a baby a massage, it can be really enjoyable for even the youngest newborn. But there was an interesting thing that researchers have found, and it's that if we sort of clearly show the baby what we're about to do, make eye contact, we talk to them soothingly, and we sort of make our intentions really clear, then it could be a very enjoyable experience for the baby. But if we do it without eye contact and sort of in a fast, not very connected way, then actually babies respond in a similar way to when they were given immunizations. So it's almost like it's painful and stressful for them. And I thought that that was a really interesting thing, and it's something that is really good to know.
Yeah, I had that for my next segment here. I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So you said that they are in your book, you said they are calmed by soothing touch, but they find it stressful when touched in silence and without eye contact. They're already very
Yeah,
perceptive. That's really insane. So you said they respond as if they're being like in the same way as being immunized, if you're
yeah,
kind of massaging them or touching them without, looking at them or reacting with them.
yeah. And if we think about it, like it actually makes sense because everything is so new to them that maybe something that they don't anticipate at all can feel very stressful to them.
Wow. Jumping back to the last topic real quick. Besides reading to your baby, is there anything else you should do while your baby's in the womb to take advantage of the skills they have there?
Well, I think things like playing music, going outside, I think everything that generally is good for the pregnant mom is also good for the baby because they can feel a lot of what we feel. And I think another interesting fact, and I think that's a little bit more well known, but that some of the flavors from our diet are transferred in a very slight way through the amniotic fluid to our babies. And so I think it's pretty cool that even during pregnancy, they're already getting to know and to learn a little bit about their family, what their families do about their culture, and things like that. So they're a lot more kind of present already,
Yeah, that's
even though
super
we can't
interesting.
see them yet.
They often tell you that the baby gets flavors from your breast milk, but I didn't know it was
Yeah,
through the amniotic fluid as well. That's awesome.
yeah.
So going back to once they're born, stimulation, can you talk about, you talked about it in your book, there's things that we can do that kind of hinder the sensory development. So like what are some examples of excessive stimulation and how does that hinder their progress and learning?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think in many ways we underestimate babies, but in some ways we also overestimate them a bit. And I think there's this idea that we can provide a lot of enrichment in their early month and weeks and the first year or two, which is really true. But it's sort of what we do that makes the biggest difference because it's not necessarily the amount of stimulation that we provide, but it's more about the quality, about what they can take in and what helps their development. And I think there are some misconceptions around it because it's actually fairly easy for something that seems stimulating and interesting to adults to be overstimulating for a very new babies. And I think it goes back to how young babies learn, which is really how all of us learn, how older children and even adults learn. So to notice something and to learn about it, we first have to notice it and to separate it from everything else around it. Like say, you're out for a walk and you're noticing a bird in the tree, and you have to kind of visually separate it out. Then we have to pay attention to that particular object, kind of store it in memory. And then by kind of adding observations like that, then our mind, our brain creates a pattern. So we start realizing that those things in the trees or flying in the sky are birds. And so it's similar for our babies. They need to learn about something. They have to kind of separate it from everything else. And so if there is a lot of excessive noise or visual clutter in the environment, or if our babies are already tired and a bit overstimulated, it's a lot harder for them to kind of notice those new things. And because they don't have that focused selective attention that older children and adults do. To them, everything is interesting and new and exciting and worth paying attention to. So it's almost like their brain is like casting light on absolutely everything around them. And so if we provide a bit too much, it's harder for them to really notice any one particular thing. So that's sort of, I think, one thing that I found really interesting and useful for the early weeks and month with my own kids. And then another thing is the idea of sensory integration. So for them to also notice and learn something, it helps if they can perceive that object through several senses. So, for example, if they're hearing a bird sing and see it at the same time, that helps them kind of bring together all the information coming from all different senses. So if they have, like, say, there's a family dog and they can feel it and hear it and maybe smell it, then it all comes together for them a little more easily.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was a quote from your book which kind of touches on this, and it said, "Bright lights can block baby's ability to distinguish patterns, shapes, and colors. Background noises louder than 50 decibels reduces the baby's ability to hear differences in pitch, intensity, and sound patterns. Strong odors, smoke, perfume overwhelm some of their senses, even taste buds, and yeah, and even the movements." You mentioned something in the book as well, which was like babies can't move their like they can't move their gazes. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we can set up the environment so that they can learn?
Yeah, so as adults, if I wanted to look to the side, I can quite easily just shift my gaze to the side and look that way and still be able to fully notice what I'm looking at. But for young babies, it's harder for them. They really only and it has to do both with their sort of the ability to control their muscles, their vision. So to really notice something, it helps if their trunk and their head and their gaze is all aligned, and which is a lot harder for them to do if they're sitting, for example, in one of the like little infant bucket seats or otherwise contained, because it's harder for them to move yet in general. And so when the baby maybe is on the floor, whether they're doing tummy time or they're just on their back or they're in our arms, it's a lot easier for them to fully kind of turn towards something and then to really notice what it is that they're looking at.
Yeah, that's really great advice. I think a lot of times you think you should set your baby in something so they can see better or, have a better perspective on what you guys are doing, but it's good to know that that's actually less helpful. Can you talk about play a little bit? How should caregivers play with their babies to support neural development? Like how much should they be structuring an activity and engaging and interrupting and all of those things?
So I think a lot of it depends on the individual baby too. And it's because we can see their temperament pretty much from birth. We can see how each individual baby responds to the world around them. And it takes a while to get to know your unique baby and to really sort of see what it is that they like and what it is they're interested in. But it starts from birth. And so, but in general, all babies, of course, enjoy interaction with the main people in their lives with us. So it's a lot of that sort of serve and return, responding to baby's vocalization, whether it's like a little coo and another little sound. We can start those really early conversations with them. And so that's one way, great way to spend time with them. And then, of course, there is free play and free exploring, and that's something they can do from really early days as well. That which was something that I think not everyone realizes, that just simply putting the baby on the blanket on the floor and sitting next to them can be a great learning opportunity because they can start discovering their hands. They can start looking at things around them. And, we all know that babies cannot see very well when they're born, but actually their vision develops pretty quickly. And so even like a 6-week-old, they will be able to see things around them and kind of how things change. And again, starting to notice patterns around, how light travels, how their own fingers move. And so there's a ton for them to learn, even without necessarily going to like a mother and baby group or a library yet, and things like that. Although there's also nothing wrong with, of course, with doing those things if the parents enjoy it as well. Like I think my kind of main takeaway from the research in this area was that don't feel pressured to go and do things with your baby in terms of enrichment or swimming or library time unless you as a parent feel ready and feel like it benefits both you and the baby.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one thing you mentioned in the book that's related is that I think it was a study where the amount that a parent kind of interfered or repositioned while a baby was trying to investigate something, it could actually hinder their neural development. I don't want to say hinder neural development. What you said was more like, yeah, stronger brain development happens when you do those things less, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it goes back to that attention development. And so initially, babies pay attention to absolutely everything, right? And it's especially things that are new, but they also, everything is new. And so they're paying attention to everything around them. But as they grow, their focus develops further. And so they kind of move away from paying attention to everything to being interested in certain things more and more. And that starts from the really early days. And so what studies have shown is that when parents support, in this case, a lot of the research was done with moms and babies, just because that's easier to study. But I think we can generalize this to all parents and all committed caregivers. But the more parents follow babies' focus of attention, so allow babies to explore what it is that they're interested in the moment, instead of sort of repositioning and say, hey, look at this new rattle grandma bought for you, then the more babies are um, able to explore the objects sort of in greater detail and greater depth. So their play becomes more complex, even at this age already. And also, when parents do this often, then these babies tend to grow into toddlers who enjoy independent play more. So they're
Mm.
sort of more used to following their own lead and their own interests. And I actually found that personally especially with my first, I found it a bit hard not to interfere, because I'd be excited about her, mastering new skills or playing
Mhm.
with a new toy that we just got and things like that. And so I almost had to sit on my hands a little bit and just be like, okay, let's just see. And oftentimes she really surprised me, because she would use a toy in a totally different way from what I imagined, but it was
Mhm.
just as good and probably better for her.
Yeah. When I had my daughter, I was reading a lot about Montessori stuff. And I'm a little skeptical of Montessori before, they're toddlers, but there were some principles which are similar to what you're saying, which is like allow them free time to, gaze around and explore the world. So I luckily had some of that in my head with my daughter. But it is really hard because like you said, you really want to help them and show
Mhm.
them what you have for them. One thing that comes up a lot on my show is attachment theory, attachment parenting, or trying to get a strong attachment with your baby. And whenever we talk about that, it's always in relation to how you feed them or baby wearing and all these different things. And you mentioned these things as techniques, but you said there was a really strong factor to the bond that you make with your baby, which was called mind-mindedness, which I had never heard of before your book. Can you talk about that and what it is and how to foster it?
So, mindedness is probably my most favorite topic to read about. And it's interesting because a lot of us practice it intuitively, but have never heard the term. So, mind-mindedness is a way of thinking about young children. And it's something, what's beautiful about it, that it doesn't require purchasing anything. It doesn't require any kind of learning over a long period of time, certain set of skills. It's something that we can just it's a mindset that we can adopt, which I think is very beautiful. And so it's a way of thinking about even young babies as people with minds and thoughts and feelings of their own from the very, very start. And this approach helps us try and see the world from their perspective, as opposed to sort of trying to mold them into certain types of people, or maybe it's sort of instilling certain sets of skills that we think would benefit them in life and things like that. But we, again, kind of, it helps us follow the interest and see who they are, because they already come into the world very aware and with a lot already. So it's not like the empty vessels to be filled, or cute little dolls to sort of, carry around and play with. And they're certainly very cute, but there's much more to it than that. And so studies on mindedness started in the late 80s, early 90s. And so now we have quite a good body of evidence around the effects that this mindset, this parenting mindset has on children. And so what it shows is that babies whose parents are mind-minded tend to even have better physiological capacity to regulate their emotions. It's easier for them to stay calm and to return to a calm state physiologically. And then as they grow, they tend to have stronger sort of self control as toddlers. And of course, there's not a whole lot of self control in toddlerhood yet, but it's easier for them to do things that are hard at this age, like wait, for example, wait their turn, or maybe let go of an object that they really want, which is pretty huge at that age. And then as they grow even more, it becomes easier. It's easier for them to understand and relate to emotions of other people. And then I think the longest study that followed families has now followed the children to about age 10. And so it's shown that 10-year-olds who were raised in mind-minded families tend to have stronger bonds, a stronger attachment, and less tension with their parents, which I think is pretty cool. So having kids at all the stages of development, my eldest is almost 13 and my
Oh,
youngest
wow.
is 3. So I can kind of see, like I can appreciate all these things at different stages of children's development very much. And at all stages, children show stronger attachment with their parents. And so mind-mindedness, in addition to sensitivity and responsiveness, is now often brought up as one of the really big sort of prerequisites to attachment, one of the big factors that help attachment develop.
Yeah, it seems very powerful. So, can you give mamas some examples of how to practice that or what it looks like kind of in day-to-day situations?
Yeah, so it could be as simple as, for example, we have our baby maybe playing on the floor and we're watching them. And instead of thinking again about, oh, like I'll offer my baby this, we try to see the world and what the baby's seeing through that baby's eyes and think about, okay, well, how might they be feeling? What are they seeing? And so just that mindful observation will help us start kind of becoming more and more mind-minded. And it was interesting, actually, one of the papers I read, the researchers developed an app where they would send the moms, in this case, like a little prompt. They would ask something like, okay, like, what are you up to? Like, what are you and your baby doing today? Or how's your day been? And then they would be kind of helped to come up with a more mind-minded response. So not something like, oh, we went to the store. And then maybe the app would say, well, um, and so how do you think your little one felt when they were in the store, in the shopping cart and things like that? So they would sort of try to um, steer the parent towards thinking about what the experience might have been like for the baby. But I think we don't necessarily need an app for that. I think it's something that if we think about it ourselves, we can just remind ourselves to think about um, everything around the baby from their perspective and not like sort of our wishes or hopes, which I think, of course, we have.
Yeah.
But sometimes it helps to set them aside or sort of um, maybe not necessarily aside, but look from both perspectives at the same time.
So, would it be things like you're looking a little sleepy, like you say that to your baby, and so let's take a nap, or let's get ready for nap, or you're looking a little uncomfortable. Is your diaper wet? Let's go check. Things like that, like where you're kind of prioritizing, like, oh, you seem to feel this. I'm noticing
Yeah.
how you're feeling.
Exactly. And maybe naming it too, right? Because
Hmm.
I think, especially for those of us who are introverted, like myself, sometimes it feels almost silly to start talking to a really young baby, because you almost, at some point you just maybe enjoying the quiet and things like that. But it does help to name what we think they're feeling or thinking, because even from about 5 months old, they are already starting to put words into categories and connecting. And even for at younger ages, they're starting to connect the words they're hearing with the actions or the objects that represent those. And so it does help for them to connect their feelings or sensations with the words that we use to describe them. And of course, we don't always know for sure what they might be thinking, but just like exactly in your example, like you said, I think you might be feeling this, or you look sleepy. I think that all helps with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned so much research on this stuff, and like it's just surprising to me that we have never heard of it, most of us. So that's a really cool thing, a really cool tool for the toolbox, I think.
That's what I've been
I
thinking the same, because there's a lot that is kind of hidden in disparate research papers, but hasn't really become kind of mainstream knowledge. And I think some of those things that just really help, like you said, they're not techniques. Like we hear a lot about techniques like baby wearing, for example, which is great. And I certainly used it with my kids, but there's sort of more to it, or there is sort of this underlying mindset or the way of seeing babies
mhm.
that I think some of these studies really help with, but they're not as well known as I would like it to be.
I just did some research for a video recently where there was a study where mothers were baby wearing, and it said that those mothers were more able to respond appropriately, not just like they responded faster and also appropriately. And I think in your book, I think it was where you mentioned that appropriate responses to your baby is really key too.
Yes,
So I think that's the
absolutely.
same as mind-mindedness. It's like it's not just baby wearing that will get you there.
Exactly, exactly. It's trying to figure out what it is that they need. And because, yeah, like, I think I talked about that in the book a little bit as well. But I remember my first prenatal class when I was pregnant with my first daughter. And when the instructor asked us, like, what do we think of when we hear responsiveness, which is, of course, really important with our children. And then everyone said, well, we have to respond promptly. We have to respond quickly. And that's what comes to the forefront. But to be truly responsive, the response also needs to be appropriate. And we won't be spot on all of the time, of course, and that's totally normal and to be expected. But it's this idea of not just quickly soothing the baby, because we can't, maybe, like, we, of course, we will feel flustered when our babies cry, right? Like it's been shown that the brain activation in the parent's brain is so quick, because as soon as the babies cry, we're sort of wired biologically to do something, to move, to speak, to soothe. And
Mhm.
that's very, very normal. But it's also that how appropriate the response is, to not just kind of soothing, but also seeing what it is that they might be missing, what it is in the environment that might be difficult for them, because that is what would truly soothe and comfort the baby. So
Yeah.
it's taking that moment, to allowing yourself to take that moment to try and figure it out.
Okay, so just a quick note. I guess I only have 10 minutes left on my Zoom plan for a recording. So we'll just keep going and see how far we can get, okay?
Sounds
Um,
good.
so I wanted to talk a little bit about sleep. I've covered sleep in the show before, a little bit about the biology of sleep. So I just wanted to kind of touch on some things that were new to me or that I found interesting that I thought the audience would find interesting too. One thing that I thought was interesting was you talked about a study that showed that 1-month-olds reinitiated sleep on their own 1 out of 3 wakings, which means they have the ability to sleep on their own or return to sleep on their own that early. I don't think that's really talked about. Can you talk about that a little bit and, sleep environment and how to cultivate that skill of babies being able to sleep on their own? And in your
Yeah, I
book, you
think
you kind of approach this without subscribing to any particular sleep method. So that was nice to stay away from the controversy.
that's right. Yeah. So what I try to do is to just look at the science behind baby sleep and just bring out, the information, exactly the information that not everyone might know, without necessarily feeling like parents have to do or not do certain things. But I found that really interesting as well, that 1 in 3 very young babies were able to go to sleep without probably their parents even realizing that they've been awake. And so they have that ability. And I think it's still a little bit unclear as to why some babies could do that, and others not as much. But it probably has to do with their temperaments. Like some babies are born a little more settled. And so they actually even often measure certain temperament characteristics, like apart from just being able to see the baby's personality and temperament emerge. Some of it is measured as a percentage of quiet sleep at birth. So babies who slept deeper for longer stretches at birth tend to be kind of more settled babies. But of course, things change, and it's a bit of a range and a scale, as always. But it's certainly something that we can support as well, and we can help them kind of sleep as well as they can as early as they're ready. Like that's been sort of my mantra with my own kids, and I mentioned it in the book because we can't if my third, for example, had very severe reflux, and so
Mm.
sleep was way harder for him, and everything was really hard for him in the beginning, and so I couldn't possibly imagine sort of him sleeping as well as my middle daughter has, for example, because he just physically wasn't able to do so. And I can see how some babies with more reactive personalities, or not personalities, I should say temperament, more reactive temperament. Personality is more of an interaction of temperaments with environment. But babies come wired differently, and they experience the world differently. But we can do things to help them get there when they're ready. And I think one of them would be when we notice these signs that the baby can settle to sleep on their own and they seem comfortable, we can support that. And often it just means, for me, what it meant is noticing getting up and looking in the bassinet and noticing that actually their eyes were closed and they were just moving in their sleep. And instead of picking them up and immediately feeding or holding them, just giving a few moments to see, like, are they actually awake? Because that was my big revelation with one of my kids, is that she was not. She was still sleeping. And it was me, because I was so, as a new mom, it was just reactive, a little grunt, and just ready to jump up, and just giving again that tiny pause that's really
You mentioned in the
helpful.
book, so a lot of advice out there tells you to try to put your baby down drowsy but awake. And with my daughter, at least her temperament, I just found that to be absurd. It just didn't work. So what is your advice? What is your kind of tweak to that approach?
Yeah, I totally agree. I have not yet met a baby for whom it works. It did not work for either of my three for all different reasons, but it just seemed like they would either startle themselves awake or they just wouldn't want that. And so it just didn't work. And so what I would do is I would actually try to into bed fully awake instead of waiting for that, stage where they're sleepy enough that being put from being held onto the sleep surface would be jarring for them. And so, if the independent sleep is the goal, what I have done, and it's worked really well for one of my babies, and actually amazingly, or even both two, I would say two, and for the third as well, but just later in his development, was just putting them to bed when they appear tired but awake, and then seeing what support they need from there. For one of my babies, it just meant just stroking her forehead really gently, and she just drifted off to sleep, no problem at all. And then, for another baby might not be ready for that kind of, just put to bed awake, and leave the room kind of transition. And so for some, I think being put to bed fully asleep is also just absolutely fine. And that's what a lot of people can do as well. One advice that I have from reading the research is that for parents who put their babies to bed fully asleep, is wait about 10 minutes for young babies before the transfer, because they would be in much deeper sleep at that point.
Got it. You also talked about the fact that babies seem to have a standard wake time, and it might be standard for each baby, might have a slightly different wake time, but so it's important to set a bedtime so that you can get the amount of sleep that's required. Can you talk about how to find or achieve that bedtime?
Yeah, it's tricky. And something I found was just, again, watching each baby and closely, and just figuring out what works for them. Like the study you mentioned, it was done across many countries. It seems like bedtimes seem to vary depending on, like, on average in different countries. But children tend to wake up really early, between 6 and 8, which is, for some of us, it doesn't feel like really early, but for me, it does. And so, depending on if they go to bed later, then their total amount of night sleep would be less. And so, in some cases, they can be compensated by napping more, but in some cases, when children are maybe in daycare, that's not necessarily going to happen. And so, it's being mindful of that total amount of sleep and finding the bedtime that keeps them rested. And there's quite a wide range of how much each child might, how much sleep children need in a 24-hour period. And so it's finding what kind of where in that range your child is, and then maybe moving bedtime gradually earlier, to find that sweet spot. And what I also find, and that's also supported by the research, is that sometimes what we think of as that last nap of the day, for babies, might actually be their bedtime. And so sometimes the baby would nap and then be pretty wired and not go to sleep until much later. And so what we can try is kind of treat that waking as a waking and not as getting up. Time, and see if gradually the time that they go down for the nap would become their new bedtime.
Okay. Yeah, I remember, I forget what age my daughter was, but I ended up putting her to bed at 7 p.m. and I would just go to sleep with her. I remember going to sleep at 7 p.m. because we had a very rough time with sleep and she would sleep for 4 hours for the first sleep of, stretch of the night. And then I would just try to get that sleep too. So it looks like I only have a minute and 30 seconds left of my Zoom plans recording. And so just rounding out the sleep topic, you have kind of a controversial opinion on sound machines compared to what the normal advice is. Can you explain that? Because I ended up using one for my daughter and it seemed like it did actually soothe her. So what did I get that wrong?
No, not necessarily. But I think it's what I would do is be mindful of the volume, because actually a recent study tested many commercially available sound machines and found that some of them really exceeded the limits that are considered safe for babies. And so it's more being mindful of where you put it. And then the authors suggested not putting it close to the baby, because especially if you're trying to block the outside noise, and that if that's the goal, is putting it closer to the source of the noise. So it might be the window if you're blocking, say, traffic outside, or maybe it's the door if you're trying to block rambunctious older siblings or pets, noises coming into the room. And so I think that's the piece that not very many people know, is that you don't want the sound machine on high volume placed right next to the baby. And then the other thing is some babies sleep just fine without, and so it might not be necessary, which would make traveling and sleeping elsewhere more easily for the
Awesome.
family.
Thank you. One thing Anya covers in her book that we didn't get to talk much about is screen time. So I'm going to have my phone here and read a couple of things I wanted to cover with her, but we didn't get to. So a lot of people think that there are educational shows for their babies, and they'll put their 4-month-old in front of baby Einsteins or something. And that's actually not the case. It's not actually doing much for your baby. So she talks about several negatives for screen time, and these are less interaction. So babies are not interacting with their adults or other children. There's less free movement. There's less learning. So babies begin to grasp the laws of physics by recognizing patterns in daily life. The television world, however, does not have the same laws. In real life, a ball moving to the right will continue to move to the right until it stops. A ball on a screen moving to the right may disappear from view, only to reappear on the left to continue the rightward motion in an edited action sequence. Watching screens does not help babies learn about the world around them. Another negative is less sensory integration. Sensory input coming from the screen is not as coordinated as in real life. For example, watching a flower on a screen does not allow a baby to experience the full sensations of touching and smelling a real flower. Learning is harder without a complete picture. I think in the interview, Anya mentioned that sensory integration is a really key part of how babies learn. So seeing and hearing something at the same time in the real world is a real key for having them learn. She said, essentially, these are lost opportunities. Are they significant, though? And the answer is they can be, depending on how much screen time babies get. According to a large survey, 3-month-olds on average watch about an hour each day. This might not seem like much, but babies of this age sleep for 16 or more hours per day and spend another 3 or so hours feeding and being changed and dressed. That means that screen time takes up almost a quarter of their awake time, a considerable portion. So what about positive effects? What about the educational benefits claimed by the producers? The problem is, even if a show's content can be considered educational, babies are not developmentally ready to understand it. It's a demanding cognitive activity. She goes on to say, she has a very poignant graphic in her book that lists the negative effects and has a column for positive effects where she lists none. The last thing that I wanted to talk about with Anya that we didn't get to cover is intuition. And I thought that was a really nice tie-in to what this show is all about. A lot of times as a mom, you read a bunch of parenting information that you may or may not, it just might not sit right with you. And so you kind of rely on your gut instinct or that intuition inside of you to figure out what your baby needs. Because your baby is different and nobody knows your baby as well as you do. And so she says a couple of things. She says, intuition is a true form of knowledge because it comes from the way our brains store, process, and retrieve memories. In essence, we subconsciously call on information from past experiences stored in our memory and combine it to draw new conclusions. Highly intuitive people extract the maximum amount of significance from the available information because they see meaning in details others may overlook. So, intuition is the synthesis of experiences we carry with us. But where do these experiences come from? In the context of raising babies, they could be the product of careful observation, our cultural biases, and fads. The interesting part that she says is that these sources are not equally reliable. Depending on the source, intuition can be accurate, but it can also be very wrong. I think that's interesting because a lot of us seem to think of our intuition as a kind of bulletproof way or, radar to assess what to do or, a feeling about a thing. And it could be that it is a gut reaction based on some cultural or societal fad that's going on. And maybe your brain processes that and puts it it pulls it out of you as your gut feeling. So it's possible that your intuition could be wrong. But I think a lot of the times when it comes to knowing who our baby is and how to take care of it, I think it's probably right. So those are the things I wanted to cover outside of the conversation I had with Anya. The book is great. I really highly recommend it. And I wanted to also note where to find Anya because she didn't get the chance to tell us herself. So you can connect with Anya through her website, kidcology.com, or check her out on Facebook and Instagram. She also has the book that we mentioned, Baby Ecology, Using Science and Intuition to Create the Best Feeding, Sleep, and Play Environment for Your Unique Baby. It's available on Amazon, a variety of ebook retailers, and can always be ordered through local bookstores or checked out at the library. So please do go ahead and check out Anya. I don't think you'll regret it. And if you like this podcast, go ahead and like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Maybe leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That would help me a ton. You can also check out my other episodes. If you're watching YouTube, you can click on the playlist that's going to come up at the end of the video. Thanks so much. See you next time.